Сайн байцгаана уу эрхэм үзэгчдээ. Өнөөдрийн манай SYndicate Talk нэвтрүүлэг эхэлж байна. Энэ удаагийн дугаараар бид улс төрийн эрсдэл гэдэг сэдвийг хөндөж хичээж байна. Тэгээд энэ удаагийн маань зочид маш эрхэм зочид цугласан байна. Анх удаага нэвтрүүлгийг эхэлснээс хойш манай 22 дахь дугаар дээр 4 доктор цугласан байна. Тэгээд зочдоо би танилцуулъя. Миний зүүн гар талд их хурлын гишүүн доктортой хөгжлийн дэд хорооны дарга Ундраа доктор ирсэн байна. Дараагийн гишүүн маань ерөнхий сайд асан санхүү эдийн засгийн их сургуулийн доктор, ректор амар жаргалгай хүрэлцэн ирсэн байна. Тэгээ манай гадны зочин маань Робин Warwick and Roger компаниг үүсгэн байгуулагч, мөн гүйцэтгэх цагтрал мөн доктор хүн байна. Дараагийн зочин маань төвшин төгс эдийн засгийн судалгаа, эрдэм шинжилгээний хүрээлэнгийн захирал мөн доктор хүн байна. Тэгээ одоо энэ гадны зочинтой учраас англиар авна. Ингээ би эхний асуултад тавья. Thank you very much for your time and accept my invitation. So since we are going to talk the political risk, so I would like to start with the one case. Just a few days ago, China has made amendment on its constitution that Mr. Xi Jinping could stay in the office indefinitely. Also, in a few days, there will be a Russian president election, and most likely people say that Putin will be elected again, which means the eternal two neighbors, the political system and also the stability is quite great, as some people say. Is this good or bad for Mongolia? How do you see this positioning? Anyone could start.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having us. I know as soon as the decision was adopted in China, I've seen news media around the world starting their headlines with Mr. Xi Jinping being like, it's almost like a kingdom has started or it's back. And I think the stability is good in the sense that it's predictable, but on the other hand, how would the people respond in the long term, whether the current stability would stay on, and whether if there are any challenges in the Chinese society, both economic and social, how it would, let me use the term, erupt over time. So I hope it wouldn't, there's not serious issues that are staying in the society that would not result into some sort of instability in the society, which would impact not just the country itself, but all the regions, all the neighboring countries, and all the trade partners that would range from very small to very large, such as United States. For US, for example, China is their #1 trade partner. It's also true for us. So I think anything happening in Chinese economy, Chinese society would impact the world whether we want or not.
Thank you. Actually, I do agree that it will be more predictable for the world, particularly because of the idea of continuity of both the local and global ambitions of Xi Jinping. Locally, I think he wants to strengthen the party and make sure that there's, particularly the Communist Party, make sure that the Communist Party will remain at the center of Chinese society. Whether or not that's good or bad is something that can't be judged by an outsider. But in the security arena, particularly in Southeast Asia where I'm from, I think you'd see also continuity in the claims of China in the South China Sea. How the region will react will depend on the local politics of each country. For the Philippines, for example, where I'm from, I think as long as Duterte will be there, we will see a continuity in policy where Philippine foreign policy aligned with China, and then there are more friendly relations. But you'd see a difference in world politics once there's a new US president. So I think it's really how the world reacts to this continuity in China. But I do agree that we cannot ignore China, and that's something that we still need to observe in the long term.
How do you see this as a
Well,
researcher?
I'm by training an economist, so I am not really good at talking politics side of things. But the relationship with China is basically determine very economic relations between our country and China. And as Dr. Robin mentioned, One Belt, One Road is an initiative under Xi Jinping. So, but the details of this big initiative are yet to emerge more clearly. So everybody is talking about One Belt, One Road, but details are missing. So predictability, continuity of policies on Chinese side, I guess it's a good thing because we know what to wait or what's coming. But again, there is this lack of details of this initiative. So yeah, with the continuation of current regime, I think this initiative will be more, forthcoming and details will emerge. So I guess that's a good thing. On the other side, there's a risk also involved because just a few months ago, the country experienced this very capricious, even emotional approach towards a trade with Mongolia because they suddenly closed the borders and it had huge economic impact in terms of shipping our coal to China. So we have that kind of risk in terms of if the current regime continues, there is not much of accountability on the other side because it's a one-sided issue basically. So we have to be careful, but from the economy side, there is a very little way out of this for us because we are just too dependent on export to China. So I have these two issues. One is good thing, One Belt, One Road, but on the other hand, we have to be very vigilant on the risk side as well.
Thank you. Mr. Amarchal?
Well, stability is very important for Mongolia, and we want to see our neighbors stable, prosperous, and very much involved in international affairs countries. And in this regard, the stability provided by institutions, one thing, stability provided by person, personal charisma is also another issue. But in both cases, in case of Russia, in case of China, I would say that personal aspect and institutional aspect somehow goes hand in hand. And in that regard, I don't see any big trouble in terms of amendment to the Chinese constitution allowing Xi Jinping to stay in power for certain years, and also results of the Russian election. I do believe that stability, predictability of these countries' leaders, their policy, economic, social, and other foreign policy and so on, I think will bring a more positive outcome for Mongolia.
Thank you. If we see the last few years, the global political arena, specifically in the European Union and North America and also the Asian some countries, the people is very cautious about the rise of populism, maybe it's including Mongolia. And how do you see its economic and social impact of the populism?
Well, I think there's a need to define populism. So many people, I think today it's a misused term, I believe, in popular discourse and discussions all over the world, the Philippines, even Mongolia, United States, with the rise of Trump. And I agree with some European countries that have elected supposedly populist leaders. But really, I'd like to put forward, I'm not sure if the group will agree, populism is a political or rhetorical style that creates this narrative of me against or us against a particular enemy. So how that enemy is defined is up to that leader. For the Philippines, for Duterte, the enemy is the drug users, right? For Trump, the enemy is the other countries that are abusing America. Supposedly, that's why there's the America First policy, right? But really, if you look at populism and observe how it's playing out in the world, there are really two types of populisms. The first is political populism. And this is where this idea of immigration and race politics and ethnic politics will come in. That's why I believe in Mongolia as well, there's an anti-China rhetoric that played out. I'm not really sure about the details of which party, but yeah, so some leaders get elected and play out this whole narrative story of an enemy, right? So in that sense, the enemy is China, or the enemy may be Russia. Enemy may be a country, maybe a person, right? So how that translates to policy would be stricter immigration laws. That's why you see that in Europe, there's a big discussion on immigration, right? Even in the United States with the whole wall, right, with Mexico, with Latin America. And also you can talk about citizenship, discussions on citizenship. And this is where it's related to what I call economic populism. I think a scholar, Danny Roderick, discussed this. He's a political economist in the United States, where economic nationalism will play in. What that means is that you get more protection, tariffs will increase, which is what happened in the United States. Steel tariffs were increased for imports of steel from other countries. So although political populism and economic populism are different, they're also related. And I believe we have to disaggregate or to dichotomize the two types of populism in order to really understand what populism is and how it will affect your society or different societies all over the world. So I'm not sure if you agree with that distinction, and I'm not sure how it plays out in other countries, but with the examples given in Trump, Philippines, Europe, and Latin America, I think that's a fair observation to have.
Yeah, I agree with Robin. We have to really define what populism means, because there has to be some definition. But for Mongolia, I don't think we are anti-China, but everybody knows we are on the economic side. We are very, very dependent. So that's why in very big strategic documents we try to diversify the economy. We want to have an economy less dependent on mining and on one trade with just one country. So even at the very, I think it's a security document. I don't know what it's called in English.
National security.
Concept
of national security.
Even in the concept in that document, it's a very big document. There is an article saying you cannot expose your country economically up to more than 34% or something like that to one country.
Interesting.
So that shows you we are aware of too much dependency. But very big question becomes, how do you define 34%?
Yes.
What is the share of, how do you calculate that number? So that was a very, very big issue, it turned out. So I agree we have to define, but again, we are much aware, but I wouldn't say we are anti-China or anti-one country.
It seems like the populism is, of course, one can say that, populism is what individual politicians say what would be popular. Yeah. And is something popular always right for the larger interest? And often it can be, but in some cases it is not. And even the politicians who use political populist rhetoric, they understand that it may not be in the best interest of the country in a larger sense or in the long term, but even if they knew it, they would still be saying whatever is popular just to gain a short-term political advantage. So it can be political elections, or it can be gaining more support within his or her own political party, or it can be a political party that is being populist as well. So promising cash handouts to people is a prime example of populism. When one party promises, the other promises even larger amount. So competing on who can be more populist is it's quite insane, I would say. And I think around the world, nationalism is on the rise. So I think some of the example is it's protectionism. You know, we have seen maybe in the beginning of 2000s, it was the era of globalization. World has gone flat. The barriers are down. Even now, well-established unions such as EU is, you know, there's some issue with its integrity and whether it can stay together after Brexit or not. And the election results in France and several other countries, even Mr. Trump as well, you know, it is America first. And in Russia, I think the Russian people are very proud of its country. It's a wonderful country, but I think the sentiment is definitely being cemented time and again.
Actually, I do have a comment on I do agree with the observation of MP Undra that there's also social dimension to populism where populism can cascade to social policy like handouts, conditional cash transfers, and such policies. But I actually disagree that there is a retrench in globalization. For anything, the TPP was just signed a few days ago. You will see an ASEAN economic community. You'll see the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, led by China, but also initiated by the ASEAN. And if we talk about the ASEAN being a central regional bloc in Asia Pacific, it will affect so many countries all over the world. So essentially, these are regional groupings that aim to remove barriers in trade. So in my honest opinion, in my humble opinion, I see more globalization, more economic globalization rather than less. That's why I think, again, I go back to the point, it's important to differentiate economic populism and political populism. I do agree that nationalism is on the rise, but I don't think the nationalism has cascaded down to economics, but I believe that it did cascade to more nationalist sentiments on the immigration side and the social policy side.
Yes, well, in Mongolian case, a little bit situation is different, especially the economic nationalism very much directly related to the populist activities of politicians. And in this regard, I just interested on the issue, what's the origin of populism? And when you look to the nerve politics, you will see, for example, in Mongolia, it's a political system directly creating populism. Election system, the origin of populism in Mongolia, it's definitely. And to a certain extent, social media also providing huge opportunity to be populist and to follow the populist activities. And in general, if you look around the world, you will see that rational aspect, rational thinking, it's already not working. Common sense, it's not working. Everything is a more emotion, and everybody wants to approach your emotion rather than common sense, or rather than your rational expectations or rational thinking. And just recently, a Nobel Prize was awarded to a person who clearly shown that, well, you have a rational expectation in terms of economic activities, rational man, but in reality, we see also other aspects. It's that people are not rational, but irrational. So this is really becoming very important issue. And when everybody looking for emotional aspect of the question, it's very hard to keep populism, and it's a combination of many factors: political system, history, tradition, environment, total environment, and all the things creating some populist activities, and I think the Mongolia can be very interesting case for political study people, how populism works in a separate independent country. So far, as I know, that the populism didn't bring any benefit for Mongolia's development, and I just wonder, do we have any positive populism? Any case of positive populism?
But I think there's this overlap of various issues for Mongolia, because we are into the democracy only 27 years. And then first 10 of which is, I wouldn't call it democracy, it's just learning, baby learning process. And maybe last 10 years we are really into how this election thing works and how people decide on who to elect. So basically, there's many overlapping issues for this country, because we are not really into democracy for many years, so that citizens, voting mass would learn from their past selections. So, and then at the same time, we are transitioning into the market economy again at the same time. So people are learning, and then also they're learning about market system. So even today, we have we still hear remnants from the socialist era, like a ceiling on interest rate prices and things like that. So the system is learning.
It's actually
it's not too many years. So yeah, there are many.
Well, you know, it's another case. Just recently, we invited one professor from Ireland to speak on Brexit issues, and his message was, well, all our politicians were against Brexit, Britain exiting the European Union. All our business community were against, and all media was against. But at the end we got so, and nobody knows. It's some kind of populism, some kind of negative understanding or emotional interpretation of globalization and so on and so on. So it's very hard to say. Even Britain, with 400 years of parliamentary democracy, made a decision to exit the European Union. So we are just 27 years old, so it should be okay for us to make some mistakes.
Actually, it's the Mongolian case is very interesting for me, because you're in between China and Russia, one of the most supposedly undemocratic states in the whole world, actually. So it's interesting how democracy developed and how Mongolia is able to navigate the world, you know, with two great powers and navigate it independently, supposedly, with an independent foreign policy. It's also a big term that's used in the Philippines. But yeah, it's an interesting case. Democracy, whether or not countries are ready, I'm not sure. Maybe that you, as Mongolians, you can answer whether or not you're ready for democracy.
Well, democracy for Mongolians and for Mongolia, it's not just exercising certain right to election, to the political parties and so on. It's also an issue of national security and sovereignty. And if Mongolia is democratic, we have some interest for others. Otherwise, nobody will be interested in Mongolia. And if this country wants to be sovereign country, independent country, it should be democratic. It should be very much oriented to the international market and so on. So it's a really our general understanding, I think, in the whole society.
You think democracy is important for growth and for development?
Well, we do have problems with economic growth, especially related to these populist issues and to a certain extent democratic institutions, so-called, creating some problems for economic development. But in general, democracy not only right to go and vote. Not just only to have a free, fair election or political parties, freedom of speech and so on. It's more than just these issues. It's an issue of national sovereignty of Mongolia.
And democracy was probably also somewhat natural for us, I would say. I think the sense of freedom for nomadic people have always been greater than in some other civilization, I would say. I think maybe the openness, maybe the freedom to choose where you want to move, and this sense of that you can move quite freely in nature. But of course, we are talking about political system, not just wandering in the mountains. But on the other hand, there is perhaps a certain sense of being open, as opposed to being in a very crowded society where you are always so limited in terms of personal space. And I've spent more than 10 years in the United States, and when I came, I think with the other Mongolians, we observed that even though we were previously in a communist country, the way things were done in the United States came to us more easily than people who came from other former socialist countries. So we were quick at adapting and maybe quick at learning, and maybe survival skill was better for Mongolians than compared to Eastern European countries. So is it because the nomads have to be survivors because of our harsh climate, or because sense of freedom and openness is innate in us? I don't know. But I think around the world there's also some concern and some sense, maybe some analysis that the state of democracy in general is somewhat degrading.
Yes.
So Mongolia, a few years ago, we presided over a community of democracy, and it was very important step for Mongolia, for us. And I think we accomplished that duty quite well, and it's well noted by other democratic nations. But in general, the elections and the outcomes are driven by, like Mr. Amosjagel said, not by democratic principle, but for somewhat populist stance, emotional driven populism. So is democracy always a good thing? More and more people are asking that, because some minority, those who lose in election, maybe they are concerned whether this kind of public opinion shifting, like Brexit, for example. I think the public was definitely in support of Brexit, even though the decision makers weren't, and that's why they had to decide to follow the people's opinion. Now the public opinion on Brexit, is it as good as prior to the exit or not? It's clear.
Speaking of MP Undra's good, very excellent point on the global retrenchment of democracy. With China rising, I think there's more to the point of the diffusion of the undemocratic practice of China. You can already see that in so many countries, actually, where authoritarianism is being promoted instead of democratic ideals. And it's such an interesting case that Mongolia is still a democracy, despite being a neighbor of China, despite it being a neighbor of Russia, where other states, like other former communist states in Southeast Asia, in Vietnam, for example, in Cambodia and Laos, the Chinese idea of undemocratic market development is taking so much taking so much influence in society. It's really, really interesting.
As I remember, a few years ago, I think a former American vice president or state secretary said Mongolia is oasis of democracy. Yeah? So just a few years ago, yeah?
Actually, it was at the conclusion of this community of democracy presidency. And at the time, MP Oyun, she was a member of parliament at the time, we initiated International Women Leaders Forum in Mongolia. And as part of Community of Democracy, we wanted to do something pertaining to women. And we approached to other foreign ministries as well as Community of Democracy Secretariat. At the time was in Poland. We also spoke to US Department of State, and our initiation have grown to a very successful event, and Mrs. Hillary Clinton came to speak at that. And I remember very clearly at our parliament building, sitting there listening to her giving a speech. If you want to see democracy at work, come to Mongolia. If you want to see democracy in success, come to Mongolia. So something to that effect. I think that speech is still on YouTube.
Yeah.
So I don't know if we are still an exemplary democracy, but we are a democracy. We are democracy at work, and something to watch for sure.
So we have the foreign guest, but it's kind of what a coincidence that you're from Philippines, and I think last year in 2017 in May, the Philippine President Mr. Duterte actually says that that the Mongolia and Turkey showed their interest to be a member of ASEAN, and Mr. Duterte would sponsor the Mongolia to be a member. So how do you understand this statement? And geographically, can Mongolia be a member of ASEAN or not? Actually, what's the?
Actually, the Mongolia is already a member of the ASEAN Regional Forum. Okay. It's a conduit of the main ASEAN organizations, but ASEAN really has 10 member states in Southeast Asia. But ASEAN has so many other concomitant organizations around it. So yeah, and in fact, in 2015, if not mistaken, Mongolia actually went to the ASEAN Regional Forum and co-chaired that regional forum together with the Philippines. And actually, the ASEAN Regional Forum is so important. It became one of the primary forums where they can discuss security issues, more security than trade and economics. I think it's the RCEP that's for economics, but that because of the rise of China, and there's a lot of instability in the security area that's being discussed in Southeast Asia as well as in East Asia. Japan as well is trying to I'm not sure if it's actual policy to rival China, but because Japan is a regional power. The ASEAN Regional Forum also includes 21, if I'm not mistaken, more than 20 member states. And with Mongolia chairing that, it's very, very important, very successful.
Robin,
yes,
Mr. Amarjal used to be Minister of Foreign Affairs in the late 1990s.
Oh, wow.
And he is the one who decided the membership for ARF.
What a coincidence. Maybe we should ask you, what do you think about it?
For Mongolian foreign policy, one aspect is international organizations, very important. We see it's very important institutions to be involved, and we're trying to be active in United Nations and other international organizations. And part of this policy was participation in regional international organizations. And at that time we tried to be part of the ASEAN, but ASEAN said, well, it's a little bit early, maybe you will be interested on ARF. Okay, we said we will be part of the ARF, and became a full member of the ARF activity. And still we want to be part of ASEAN. It doesn't matter geography. We want to be APEC member. Also very important institution. We do see that through these international organizations, Mongolia can bring their experience, their voice to the international community. I remember as a Prime Minister, when I was Prime Minister, Mongolia became the member of the EBRD. And at that time, nobody understood why Mongolia over there and Europe is there, why Mongolia geographically, all these complaints and so on. But at the end, we made it. And
now it's the largest investor, largest foreign direct investment.
So we want to be very active in terms of international organizations, part of these international organizations, and participate in the activities.
Thank you for supporting your president from Mongolia, and go back and tell her again that we are still eager to be joined.
Yeah, but I think to be a member, to permanent member of the ASEAN, you cannot be a member of a member state of the ASEAN because it's not from Southeast Asia. But you can be a member of the conduit organizations.
Some kind of associated
Yes,
organization.
associated organizations.
Yeah, and also there is some kind of invited or observer countries over there.
There are only two.
Yeah, I do understand that the security-related issue and its the role if they become the member of these international organizations. But specifically, what would be the economic and social benefit to Mongolia if you become the full member or observer member, whatever?
Trade issue?
Trade issues.
I think that's more for the APEC instead of the. But if the regional comprehensive economic partnership pushes through, if it's going to be signed this year, which is supposed to be finished last year, chaired by the Philippines under Duterte, and this year it will be chaired by Singapore. The ASEAN will be chaired by Singapore. Hopefully, the RCEP or the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership will be concluded. It's actually the rival organization of the US-led TPP. It's now called different CTPP. I think it's called differently now. But definitely because Mongolia is part of, I think it's part of the RCEP, it will have a lot of benefits, free trade, and yes, so many economic benefits, as well.
Now I would like to a little bit narrow down the topic and a little bit focus on the Mongolia. As a foreign, the political science, also there's a Mongolians. How do you see today's the Mongolian political risk and the current situation? Do you still think, last night I just read the World Economic Forum report and the biggest risk of Mongolia is, they say, the political risk and instability. Do you agree with this statement? And if so, what would be solution to stabilize this risk?
Well, I'm a foreigner, but from what I heard from Dr. Tushin, the dependence on the Chinese economy of Mongolia, of the Mongolian economy, of the Chinese economy, something that is the very definition of risk. If China decides to, not be friendly to Mongolia, then what will happen to the Mongolian economy, right? If China just decides to close all of its trade, right? Chooses against Mongolia to trade with China, then it's going to be a big problem. It's a big risk exposure to the Mongolian economy. So
why would they do it?
Well, of course, that's another discussion. I don't know if China will do it, right? But if China does do it,
because China wants to be a very active player in global level, and the international level, and they want to show to the world that we are very much committed or responsible part of the global economic system, global political system. So they will try to be everything, to be nice with neighboring countries, to cooperate and so on and so on. So I don't see any immediate reactions or special policy regarding Mongolia. If there is something goes with Mongolia wrong, if China does something wrong with Mongolia, other countries will see it. Philippines will see it, India will see it, Russia will see it, all these neighboring countries will see it, and it wouldn't give any additional credit to the China. And if China wanted to be really global and to develop this building the road and so on, they should be very responsible and very accurate player in the global affairs.
Well, the question of whether it's possible is another issue, but the question of the impact is big. If that happens, I'm not saying that it's going to happen, but actually China did that in the Philippines. All our banana exports were banned before, when we launched the case against China. So it is possible. I'm not saying that it's very probable, but it's possible. And so many other retaliatory measures against the Philippine case against China. So I'm not from Goya, but I think it is a big risk on paper.
Yes, yes. Well, I agree with Hanzoruk, and the biggest risk for Mongolia's development and for Mongolia's economy is the domestic political system, political stability. And given the recent state of the development in Mongolia, we're just really young boys in terms of democracy development. We have to learn all these democratic institutions and so on and so on. So reducing the political risk, bringing more quality to the institutions, political institutions, state institutions, civil institutions, and so on, I think is some kind of guarantee to bring the political stability. And of course, it's very much dependent on the subjective factors, and the politicians should be very much responsible people. And so the political risk, I think, is the most important issue for Mongolia. And if we can provide stability, we will have economic growth, we will have a very good relations with our neighbors, and so on and so on and so on.
Yeah, recently, just 4 months ago, we are ruling party, 65 members. So it's a very large, like we could call supreme majority. And still, even though we are from same party, we ousted our cabinet and changed the prime minister. And I was on the side of not changing the cabinet just precisely for the same reason, because we really need to aim for stability. And even though I think the next prime minister and the cabinet members are my colleagues that we work side by side from the same party, it's not because of being for one individual and against the other. It's more of the larger sense of stability, but still those who wanted change had succeeded, and we changed the prime minister. And the sheer number of prime ministers we have had since the democratic change in 1990 just speaks for itself, and how often we can change our cabinet. And the parliament is might consider amendment or new draft constitution. So in that, there are those who voice a very strong opinion of supporting very stable and strong executive branch, so that the stability of the cabinet would be stronger, and they would remain in the office and implement the policy that's set out to do. And in that sense, I think the political instability is mostly due to our own actions and how the political parties and political system is. I really hope that Mongolian political parties would develop, because in the end we are a democratic country, parliamentary democracy, and one party or another coalition, the parties would govern. They would be in power. So if the parties are mature institutionally, if they base their decisions and policy on more research and data, and have a merit-based system instead of, I wouldn't call it random, but it almost resembles the, I'm a physicist by training, so I understand how the distributions of systems are. So if system is well ordered, there is certain properties. If system is chaotic, there's another property. And we are almost obeying the properties of a chaotic system, instead of parties supposed to be structured, right? So we need to have exemplify characteristics of a system that's well ordered, and it's quite the opposite. So if the parties are not well matured, the public is very unhappy with all parties. But if the parties mature, the public would choose between among parties, good, better, or best, or worse. So there at least be something to compare, instead of this randomness and chaotic behavior.
In this case, may I ask that, you are talking about that the political party in relationship with the economic stability, also the political risk. So while listening your points, not only your party, but also Democratic Party, so we're in chaos. Does it mean that we, as a nation, we doesn't have the one vision or the certain value. Why we are still in 27 years is to me is a long time, you know, almost the generation of the kind. But why we still playing around and.
Of course, we cannot say we don't have vision. We have had many attempts and efforts, and I think it would be wrong to say people were just doing almost not accomplishing anything. I think any parliament, any government have worked very hard to come up with a long-term vision. Implementation stage, maybe it's a system's fault, maybe it's individuals, maybe it's lack of ability to play as a team or tolerate each other's difference of opinion. I don't know what that is, but definitely I think all of it added to instability. And I think this Sustainable Development Vision for 2030, and we've had the Millennium Goals. And I think it brought us some success, and we have to acknowledge what we have accomplished. But we also have to be aware that we have fallen short of what we aimed to do. And I think the Sustainable Development Goals for 2030, if we reach there, I think we would be in a stellar position. But there is also a search for kind of dream, maybe inspiration, like Mongolian Dream Club, Mongol Dream Club, and so on. I think all these efforts demonstrate that we are in search of long-term vision, greater good. There's attempt to diversify our economy, attempt to increase our export and not to be dependent on just mining. Whether we succeed is, of course, a separate question. You're an economist.
Yeah. I could see it purely from the economic side, and World Economic Forum survey is just one example. There are many examples on business environment surveys, actual surveys done from businesses. And for the past, I would say 6, 7, 8 years, our environment is not improving; it's worsening. On one side, it is because commodity prices have significantly decreased. So basically, economy is not widened. But on the other side, there's a lot of issues with policy continuity. So when you say lack of vision, maybe all the governments have had the same vision of economic development, prosperity of the country, but they differ in their policies. And then policy continuity becomes a very big issue for us. Every minister has its own vision, a medium-term vision, maybe near-term vision. So priorities get changed. And then whether we have capacity to change our priorities in instance, it's very questionable, because our capacity, as MP Undra said, is very, very limited. At parties, even at government level, at ministries, our capacity is very, very limited. So that's why, policy continuity is coming up and becoming a big issue. And that's why it's shown up on business environment surveys like what you mentioned. So again, policy continuity to me is a very, very big institutional problem. When Mr. Amujagla says institutions has to be stronger, I mean, to me it sounds like we have to have some policy continuity, some mechanisms should be put in place so that policy continuity at some level.
Can't you have that restrict law that the management policy continuity? Why not? Why we still?
I agree what you were saying. One aspect I think we should consider also, it's a civil service. If you have a really solid merit-based, as Sandra said, very good civil service system, it doesn't matter how many times government, the cabinet are shuffling or changing. And creating these institutions, this strong, solid civil service, which will provide continuity of the policy and so on. And so I think the most important issue right now for Mongolia.
It's interesting.
And because in the past years, because of this reshuffling, civil service, quality of civil service is getting, is worsening because a lot of rotations, even at very low levels at the ministries. So where this, so any system has to have a memory in order to, have some continuity. So we are losing this memory. Institutional memory is getting lost. So, so
Yeah,
it's
we've just the Parliament just passed the Civil Service Act, and in that act, the core philosophy was echoed by all various past leaders of our government, of course. And then I think the aim was, to introduce some stability and continuity of the policy, and put the requirement and merit-based requirements for especially heads of departments, for example, and then state secretaries of the ministries, so that people who have spent considerable amount of time within that ministry, overpassing various governments, cabinets, that those persons should be appointed so that they would have institutional memory and continuity. So I think there is definitely an attempt to have a better civil service, and I think we will see in after some time whether the goal was met by the.
But yeah, actually, there's a lot of talk about institutions. It's been a discussion of the world development institutions since the 1990s, during the time that there were so many democracies that has flourished. Just like Mongolia, the Philippines also became a democracy. Again, they became a democracy after the 90s. And this talk about institutions is very, very important. So that's a very. But the question is, how do we achieve institutional strength, capacity, and policy continuity, strength of the bureaucracy, civil service? And I think I'd like to add to the discussion by pointing out the example of Japan, which has always been the example for institutional strength. And according to the literature on institutional economics and political economy, there are really two things that stand out. Number one is the idea of neutrality, where the bureaucrats are supposed to be insulated from politics. They're not supposed to take sides. They're supposed to value efficiency, effectiveness in service delivery. So that's why I think institutions are very important. But also the second idea is competence. You cannot have a very powerful bureaucracy, even if they're neutral, even if they're non-political, even if they have policies, but if they don't know how to implement those things that are important, and I hope the esteemed guests would agree with us, they won't be able to have a very good government as well, right? And so, actually what's funny is that in the East Asian society, which I still think Mongolia is part of, but sometimes you identify yourself as a Eurasian society. There's so many examples of very strong institutions. But Philippines doesn't have that as well. We have the same problem. We don't have policy continuity. We have a very messy democracy, very unstable government. That's why policies are very good, visions are very good, are not implemented at all. So you're not alone. I mean, we also have that issue.
Okay, interesting. Well. Thank you. And the last question from my side. Time is running out, and. However, we were told once that Mongolia was a oasis of democracy, but according to our situational analysis, actually the economic environment is worsening, and civil service quality is still, in the question. And in the beginning of our conversation, we talked about, we have to define what's exactly populism. So maybe it sounds silly, but I would like to end my last question. But actually, what is democracy in your definition?
I wish I know.
It's a philosophical question. You have to ask Mr. Plato.
That's a hard question. That's a very complex question. Actually, I don't think there's a consensus among scholars who've tried to understand democracy from a sociological, economic, political perspective. But and this is my own. I'm not a philosopher, but I think it's really liberal values. being able to choose for yourself. The individual is empowered to make choices for themselves. Whether or not these choices are good for him, as long as he's able to make a choice, that's democracy. I'm not necessarily for that. For that definite. But if we're talking about how to define it, then maybe that's how we can define democracy.
Thank you.
Economist Intelligence Unit are providing the index of democracy, and China, out of 167 countries, it stands on 137. So it's very far behind. Mongolia is very high in terms of democracy, but how to define democracy? Nobody knows. Even economists don't know it, and they made some remarks at the end of the note paper that our definition of democracy very unclear. We don't have a common definition of democracy, but we bringing categories such as free, fair election, political parties, freedom of speech, and so on. But if you look deeper, for example, political parties, she mentioned was the quality of the political parties, and so on and so on. It's totally mess. It's really mess. So it's very difficult to define democracy. Just it's an American interpretation of democracy, one thing. Chinese interpretation of democracy, totally different. Yeah. So Mongolia's definition of democracy should be also somehow reflecting the Mongolian reality, and but in general, we do believe that. For example, I'm also economist in background. So I would define democracy as a function of income, certain level. If you reach the $8,000 per capita income, you can talk about the democracy and so on, and equality and so on. If it's lower than $8,000, just forget about the democracy.
It's very fair. Do you agree with that?
No. Definition of democracy is, to me, you should go back like John Locke, Thomas Jefferson definition. So those are very. It's just my understanding. I'm not a political scientist, so the very definition of that was given by John Locke or Thomas Jefferson. I think that's something people would agree on, because it's basic rights, liberties you're talking about. After that, I'm not sure. Because I'm in a very privileged position because I'm not a political scientist.
Very professional economist, yeah. Doesn't make any comment on the.
No, it's very nice. It should be certain level of economic developments and people living standard. Then you can talk about the democracy and political institutions, participation, your voice, gender issues, and so on. When you hungry. And if you don't have a place to live and job and so on, you're really just following who can promise you everything. And this is also one of the reasons of why populism is so high, because we still, despite all this, our success and so on, we're still very backward country in terms of economic development, economic structure, and so on.
I'm afraid I have to disagree because I think, in my opinion, democracy is people agree to uphold a common value, that they would decide collectively their government, or they would choose together, but they would follow the decision and the choice of the majority, even if the minority doesn't agree with the majority. So it's a system of deciding the fate of a large group.
Well, it's
of
a formal issue, check and balance and so on and so on. We still don't have these institutions, check and balance. Still, it doesn't work in
GDP
Mongolia.
per capita lower than $8,000.
No.
Does American economists say that's 70,000 per year?
Well, maybe.
You can agree to uphold the value of the majority, even if you are not so wealthy. So I think, so for example, when Mr. Mahatma Gandhi was leading India out of the colonialism to independence, and look at what he had, and then look at what they had is per capita income. And I think India's GDP per capita is still very, probably lower than ours, I'm not sure. But still, I think so. I believe in democracy.
Good. Thank you very much. Finally, to sum up the program today, probably I would say just 2 words, 3 words maybe. Rationality versus emotion. Let's see which one is win. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.